who haven't made up their minds to look at this moment in history. This is not an immediate moment. You can be for the wall or against the wall. You can think what we're doing at the southern border is inadequate. But that issue pales before the issue before us. And that is how far an executive can reach when Congress does not want to do what that executive wants. It is a crucial moment. This is a moment historians will look back on. This could be a moment that changes the fundamental balance of power in our government. So what I would ask my colleagues, I would really plead with my colleagues. I understand the politics are difficult, much harder for you than for me. But our nation, our Constitution, the beauty of this government demands we rise to the occasion this afternoon. Please join us in rejecting this emergency and keeping our government with the same balance of power that has served us so well for two centuries. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all time has expired. The clerk will read the title. The joint resolution for the third time. The question occurs.
HJ Res 46, joint resolution relating to a national emergency declared by the President on February 15, 2019.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Brasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Bennett, Blunt, Cantwell, Cardin, Collins, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Harris, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Leahy, Lee, Markey, Murkowski, Murray, Portman, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Stabenow, Toomey, Udall, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Paul, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Burr, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Gardner, Grassley, Hawley, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, McConnell, McSally, Perdue, Risch, Rounds, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, and Young. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. No. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 59, the nays are 41. The joint resolution is passed.
Mr.
The
President,
Senate be in order. The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 20.
The questions on the motion to proceed. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Bridget S. Bade of Arizona to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Bridget Bade of Arizona to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit.
Ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to calendar number 27, Senate Joint Resolution 8.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 27, SJ Res 8, joint resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 27, SJ Res 8, a joint resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal signed by 17 senators as...
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I withdraw the motion to proceed.
The senator has that right.
I move to proceed to calendar number 15, H.R. 268.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 15, H.R. 268, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30.